Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming today. And for those of you who aren't able to be here now, but listen to it later, thank you for you as well. We're really pleased today to have Keren Cox-Witton with us today. And Keren is one of the really highly active members and employees of Wildlife Health Australia, which is one of the key bodies, one of the peak bodies for wildlife health in Australia. You can become a member of Wildlife Health Australia, and I can probably arrange to get a link up there where you can find out how to join. And the information that comes out of this group is just absolutely amazing. They are on the coalface, if you'd like, of wildlife diseases and their interactions with people. Keren is a veterinarian, is the national coordinator for Wildlife Health Australia and senior project officer. And most importantly, one of the activities in her portfolio is Bat Health Focus Group. I don't know if you're the chair or the coordinator for it, but she's the one that makes it happen. And this is, again, right on the edge of wildlife and human interactions. And Keren follows all the issues that relate to zoonotic diseases of bats and how they might be transmitted to people. But more importantly, or at least from my perspective, at least, a very important part of her job is to follow potential threats that disease might have to bats themselves. And one of those potential threats is white nose syndrome. Syndrome is not present in Australia, and Keren has played a major role in trying to prevent its introduction into Australia. So Keren, do you want to share your slides with us, please? Her talk today is white nose syndrome in Australian bats.
Great, thanks for that lovely introduction, David. And hello, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak. I'd first like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm currently on, the Gadigal and Wongal people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and recognise their ongoing custodianships of land, sea and wildlife. So just before I start, David, can you see my slides okay?
Right. Yes, you're doing very well.
Thanks, David. So as David said, today I'm talking about white nose syndrome and risk to Australian bats. But first I thought I'd briefly tell you a bit about Wildlife Health Australia, just for those of you who might not know about us, and David's already given a bit of an intro. So we're the national coordinating body for wildlife health. So our vision is healthy wildlife, healthy Australia. Our core funding comes from the Commonwealth Government and all the state and territory governments. And one of our key roles is to coordinate the general wildlife health surveillance system for the country. And we're only small, there's about 8 staff in the head office, but we can do the work we do because we work with over 700 members all around the country, having some involvement at all levels in wildlife health, whether that's, vets, zoos, wildlife carers, or just interested members of the public. And we also have quite a lot of connections overseas. And Tiggy Grillo, who's my colleague, is the OIE, or World Organization for Animal Health, focal point for wildlife for Australia. And we run a number of surveillance programs. So we have a network of state and territory WHA coordinators who are in all of the agriculture agencies in the jurisdictional governments. And we have counterparts in the environment agencies as well. And we also have formal programs with wildlife hospitals based at zoos, private vets and universities. And as David mentioned, probably the most relevant focus group for this talk today is our Bat Health Focus Group. So a bit of an introduction to white nose syndrome. So it's a fungal disease of insectivorous bats. So we're not talking about the big flying foxes, we're talking about microbats. It's caused by a fungus, Pseudogymnoascus destructans, that I'm going to call PD in this talk for short. It affects bats that are, specifically bats that are during hibernation and those that hibernate in caves. So it's quite a specific disease in that way. And the first cases were seen in the US in 2006. And since then, it's spread through eastern US and up into Canada. There was a jump at one point right over to the west coast to Washington state, and it's now starting to move into the southern states as well. One of the really interesting things about this is that the fungus has now also been found on bats in Europe and in China, but while it can cause some disease, it doesn't cause the kind of mass mortalities that have been seen in North America, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So the assumption is that this fungus was introduced into the USA from Europe, and probably accidentally by a person transmitting or transferring the spores on contaminated equipment. And as David said, really importantly for us, PD has not been identified in Australia, and we certainly want to keep it that way. And I'm going to talk later a bit about some of the initiatives that trying to prevent that from happening. Okay, so what is all the fuss about? This disease has had an absolutely devastating effect on bats in North America, and there's estimates that well over 6 million bats have died from this disease. And in some roosts, the mortality rates are as high as 90 to 100%. And there's a paper that came out recently that looked at 3 particular species of bats, and they found that white nose syndrome has killed over 90% of those bat populations in less than 10 years. So absolutely significant disease of its own right because of how it affects bats and the related ecosystems. But I guess also from an economic perspective, bats perform a really important ecosystem service in that they eat insects that are pests for crops, for agriculture. So if you lose your bats, you end up with more insect pests, and of course that has flow-on economic effects for agriculture as well. So I talked a bit about the spread of white nose syndrome, and you can see on this map. So it started where that red cross is in New York State, and you can see as it's shifted out over the last almost 15 years from the purple and blue to the green and yellow, and then now into the sort of red and orange areas. And you can see over on the west that jump to Washington State, which almost certainly would have happened due to human transfer. And of particular interest for us in Australia is that sort of cluster of orange area down in Texas and some of those southern states in the US, because it was sort of assumed that because this is a disease of hibernation that it would have the most significant impacts on bats in the colder climates. But there's certainly cases turning up down in the south, and that's of particular interest for us here in Australia because obviously we also have that more temperate climate. So we're keeping a close eye. It's a bit early at this stage, but we're keeping a close eye on what's happening in those areas so that we can get some idea of what the disease could look like if it was introduced into Australia. So a bit about the fungus. It was originally called Geomyces destructans, but it got reclassified to Pseudogymnoascus genus. It loves the cold, so it likes to be below 15 degrees, but it can grow in the range of about 0 to 20 degrees. And a key thing is that it survives in the environment for long periods. Most likely it's an environmental fungus, and it opportunistically infects bats under particular circumstances. And it doesn't need bats to survive and to persist. In fact, there was a case in the US of a mine where bats had been excluded for 2 years, and the fungus was found to be growing perfectly happy in that situation. It's transmitted from bat to bat, but bats can also get infected from the environment. And the key point for us in Australia particularly is that it is transmitted on fomites. So it can be, the fungal spores can be transferred on clothes, on shoes, or on equipment. And as I mentioned, humans have been implicated in the spread of this disease. So in terms of the disease itself and its impact on the bats, it got its name because it causes this sort of white powdery fungal growth on the face, body and wings. It causes damage to the wing membranes, and that then results in dehydration, in electrolyte imbalances, various physiological abnormalities. And that causes an increased energy expenditure. It also, and possibly because of the irritation to the skin, it also causes increased arousal or waking up from hibernation. So we tend to think of animals going into hibernation of sort of going into sleep in early winter and waking up in spring. It's not quite like that. They do sort of go through sort of periods of torpor and waking up for a short period and going back down into torpor again. But the problem with white nose syndrome is that it wakes them up much more frequently, and particularly in the very cold climates at a time when there's no prey species around, and when, you know, water bodies are frozen, so there's no fresh water for them to drink. So they really have no chance of replenishing those energy reserves. And so what happens is that the energy reserves get depleted and the bats can't survive through the period of hibernation. So with this disease, you don't tend to see it at the start of winter. The deaths tend to happen sort of a few months in when they're starting to use up those vital energy reserves. So as well as those clinical signs, white nose syndrome can be seen through mass mortality. So, you know, going into a cave and seeing hundreds of dead bats on the ground, and also unusual behaviour. So flying during the day, or as I said, waking up and flying around much more frequently than you'd expect during a hibernation period. So what's happening in hibernation, obviously they're dropping their body temperature and it gets close to the ambient temperature, so about 2 to 10 degrees. So from what I said about the fungus, you can see that then gives the fungus nice conditions for it to grow on the skin. So it's a very specific situation. A bat at normal body temperature at other times of the year is not going to get this fungus able to grow on the skin. And the other key thing is to conserve energy during hibernation. The immune system suppressed. So you get a bit of local inflammation, but you don't get a full immune response to the fungal infection. But if the bat does make it, so some bats with white nose syndrome can survive through to the springtime, so their body temperature returns to normal, their immune response kicks in again, and they can actually clear the fungus at that point. So in terms of diagnosis, there is some characteristic histopathology. There's PCR tests available and also fungal culture. UV light can be used for screening. So if you hold a UV light over a bat, you can see some fluorescence. It's not necessarily for a diagnostic tool, but it's useful for screening and then to go on from there to confirm the diagnosis. And some of the sort of typical microscopic signs are this branching fungal hyphae with this distinctive curved conidia covering the epidermis. And in the skin, you get these sort of characteristic cup-like lesions. And as I said, because, you know, not much of immune response, minimal evidence of inflammation. And a key point is that there are no known human health risks for white nose syndrome. So it's not a zoonosis. Of course, there are other infectious diseases that can be transmitted to bats, from bats to humans in Australia. Australian bat lyssavirus is probably the key one in that case, but not from white nose syndrome. So one of the interesting things with this disease is that there seems to be quite a difference in susceptibility of bat species and also individuals. And there's been quite a lot of work in North America trying to work out why this might be, and whether it's some sort of tolerance or some sort of genetic resistance. And the story is still unfolding, but it seems that there are some factors that have been identified that affect susceptibility, and biological factors include the skin microbiome, which does seem to differ between bat species. So what sort of microorganisms are normally in the skin, their physiological responses, and body mass, which is pretty clear. Obviously, if they have a higher, energy reserve, it's going to be, they'll have a higher chance of surviving through to the end of hibernation. And also there's some work looking at genetic factors that affect immunity and hibernation and metabolism that could impact susceptibility to this disease. There's also some ecological factors around the way that the bats hibernate. So, for example, bats that tend to hibernate by clustering in large groups seem to be more susceptible to the disease. And also bats, so individual bats and also species like to hibernate in certain conditions. And even within a hibernaculum, so like a cave where bats are hibernating, you get these little microclimates. And it seems that bats that choose like colder, drier sites within those caves tend to be a bit more tolerant or resistant. And I mentioned before that, that the fungus has been found in Europe and Asia. And the interesting thing is you do get clinical disease in individual bats that are infected with the fungus, but the mass mortalities that we see in North America just don't occur. And the theory there is that because we believe that the fungus came from Europe to North America, is that it's been in those areas for a very long time. And so the bat and the fungus have evolved together, and you've got this sort of host pathogen balance that means it's not a significant disease. But then when it was introduced into North America, you had all these naive bats that were very susceptible. And I guess that's a concern for us in Australia, because as far as we know, we don't have PD fungus here. So if it was introduced, we could potentially be in that similar situation with all these naive bats. There's been quite a lot of research on possible treatment of white nose syndrome. There's some pretty big challenges. The first thing is, if you're going to treat bats, you have to know where they are. And we certainly, North America and here in Australia, we know where some of the bigger sort of hibernation sites might be, but there's a whole range with bats going into large areas or large groups to hibernate, or small numbers in cracks and crevices, and often they disappear for winter, and the researchers don't know where they are. So that's a big problem. Access, because they are in cave systems, and of course how to administer a treatment. You can take an individual bat with white nose syndrome into captivity, warm its body temperature up and keep it warm, and it will clear the fungus and recover. But when you're talking about treating whole colonies of bats, it's pretty tricky. You have to look at, whether aerosols possible or some sort of misting treatment at the entry to the cave. But that's a whole area of study in itself. And of course, if you're going to be spraying things around in an ecosystem, like in a cave environment, you have to think about what impact that might have on the other parts, whether it's other mammals, invertebrates, or other life forms in the cave. But there have been some promising results. Some of those have been with things like volatile organic compounds. Some probiotics are looking quite promising. UV light under certain conditions has been found to kill the fungus on skin. And there has been some work on looking at environmental treatment. So, for example, waiting until summer when all the bats have gone, and then treating the inside of the cave to kill the fungus. And polyethylene glycol is a candidate that has been looked at there. There's also this idea of what they call evolutionary rescue. So the idea being that if you have some bats that for genetic reasons or ecological reasons are less susceptible, that you try and support those bats so that they can then pass on those traits from there. And that's really about protecting them after they've survived. So things like, putting up bat boxes, for example, to give them a better chance of survival through that period. And there's also quite a lot of research into developing a vaccine. It's an interesting question because we know that there's immune system suppression. So it's a bit hard to imagine how that vaccine would work, but there are some promising results. So that's a bit of a watch this space area. So the big question for us was whether Australian bats would be at risk would be at risk from white nose syndrome. So firstly, what's the risk of it being introduced? And secondly, would it cause significant impact on bat populations if it arrived? And it's not necessarily an obvious answer, because obviously there are things in Australia that are quite different to North America. We have different bat species, different ecology, and a different climate. So the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture funded a project a few years back that we ran, and we got an expert group to do a qualitative disease risk assessment. And they looked at the possible pathways that the PD fungus could be introduced into Australia, what the likely consequences might be, and also looked at which host species, so which bat species and which geographic areas would be most at risk. And there's some ongoing work in this area as well. There's an ARC linkage project that's recently been funded. That's being led by Dr. Chris Turble at Western Sydney University. And that's a large project looking at hibernation ecology and susceptibility to white nose syndrome for Australian bats. And there's also some work doing a risk review coordinated by the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, looking at what's changed since the last risk assessment and if any mitigation measures might be needed. So these are the findings of the risk assessment for Australian bats. So the first question is whether it could the fungus could enter Australia, and they found that there was a high likelihood of entry through human activity. So that could be an Australian person who's gone overseas and is returning, or an international visitor who's been into a cave that has the PD fungus overseas and then brings back some contaminated clothing or equipment. And the sort of groups that were identified as higher risk are sort of recreational cavers, also people who work in caves overseas or here, researchers, but also tourists, because there are show caves that are open to the public that have bats. So it could be someone who's been into a show cave overseas and then came here and did the same in Australia. And in terms of whether it could affect Australian bats, we do have cave-dwelling bats, and the microbats in the southern parts of Australia certainly do hibernate, and the cave temperatures in those areas do drop below 20 degrees. So it seems clear that we have the conditions that would allow white nose syndrome to occur. And there were 8 bat species in southern Australia that were identified as at risk if the disease was introduced. There's a bit of a question of whether we would see the same large-scale mortalities that they've seen in North America because of our milder climate. And as I mentioned, that's why we're interested to see what happens in the southern US states. But I guess, you know, in terms of the bats waking up during hibernation, with a milder climate, there might be still some, although reduced, there might still be some insect prey species around and probably free water. But having said that, you know, any disturbance of hibernation can be significant. And one of the species that was identified as at risk is a critically endangered species, which is the southern bent-wing bats, which are found in Victoria and South Australia. And their entire population is within the predicted geographic area that could be at risk based on climate. And because of the other threats and their threatened species situation, any mortalities could have quite a significant impact in that species. And then so as well as the potential impact on bats themselves, there are some flow-on effects. So the ecological impact of I guess, the ecosystem in the cave being disturbed. Losing bats means you lose bat guano, and some of that is necessary, for example, for invertebrates in that environment. I mentioned the potential agriculture impact as well because of loss of insect pest control, which then can lead to, as well as sort of economic impact of increased use of pesticides, there's also potential flow on for human health and environmental impacts of increased pesticide use. And also tourism. So I don't know if any of you have been to Narracourt Caves, but there's a maternity colony there of the southern bent-wing bat that attracts a lot of tourists as well. So in terms of what we can do in Australia, I guess there's sort of 2 parts to it. There's prevention and preparedness. And so talking first about prevention, I think one of the biggest or most important activities is just education and awareness. So trying to tell Australians and overseas visitors about this disease and how they can prevent it from coming in or not bring it in. And engaging with the stakeholder groups groups like cavers and bat researchers, for example, and potentially also looking at what could be done at the border to prevent introduction. There was a process recently by the Commonwealth Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment, and particularly the Environmental Biosecurity Office, and they developed this national priority list of exotic environmental pests, weeds and diseases, also called EPIL. And part of that is a list of native animal diseases. And you can see that white nose syndrome is in the list of the top 5 exotic diseases there. So certainly been recognised nationally, the significance of this disease if it were to occur here. So in terms of working with stakeholders, we've had a really good relationship with the cavers who've been really keen to do the right thing and make sure that we don't get this disease in Australia. We've had a great collaboration with the Australian Speleological Federation. And in fact, in 2017, they organised an international congress in Sydney, which was a bit concerning because there were cavers coming from all over the world. They were coming into Sydney for the congress and they were going off to do field trips in caves. So there was a body of work around that congress working with the organisers. There was some really good planning for biosecurity for the field trips. The Australian Chief Veterinary Officer wrote a letter to all of the Congress participants. I presented at the Congress on white nose syndrome. There was a lot of interest in it from the delegates. And we also, there was a student from the University of Melbourne who did a survey of the cavers in terms of their knowledge of white nose syndrome and their sort of attitudes to biosecurity. And I've put the paper citation at the bottom if you're interested in having a look. And so the sorts of messages that we're going to the cavers is ideally, don't bring clothing, footwear or equipment into Australia that's been used in caves overseas. So try and use dedicated Australian equipment. For equipment and clothing that needed to be brought in, there are options for decontamination, and the recommended preferable treatment is submersion in hot water of at least 55 degrees for 20 minutes, although that's now been reduced in the US decontamination protocol to 5 minutes. And there is also some chemical disinfection options, which you can see in this table here. So there is a US National White Nose Syndrome Decontamination Protocol, which outlines all of the options. And also, although it's not specific to white nose syndrome, we have national wildlife biosecurity guidelines, which are on our website, which are sort of general guidance for anyone who's working with or coming into contact with wildlife. Okay, so we talked about prevention, and now in terms of preparedness, one of the important things is early detection. So if it comes into Australia, the earlier we know it's here, the more chance we have to do something about it. So we've had a sort of awareness campaign asking people to watch out for signs that could be consistent with white nose syndrome in Australian microbats. So looking for those clinical signs I mentioned, so the powdery fungus, any sort of non-traumatic damage to wing membranes, mass mortality of bats, all this sort of unusual behaviour. And we do always, I mentioned zoonoses, Australian bat lyssavirus, we always accompany our messages with this, this key message, don't handle bats. So, bats are only to be handled by someone who's vaccinated against rabies, who's wearing appropriate PPE and who has experience in handling bats. And in terms of reporting, if there are suspect cases, these can be reported to the state and territory WHA coordinator, which I mentioned. We have this network of these coordinators in each jurisdiction around the country. And there's also an emergency animal disease watch hotline for any significant wildlife disease event. And we have information on our website with contact details, and we've also prepared a suite of documents. So the one that's there on the right is for sort of general public about how to report a suspect case of white nose syndrome, what to look out for and who to call. And then we also have a separate document specifically for veterinarians about collecting samples from suspect cases to submit to the lab to test for white nose syndrome. So the other part of preparedness is response guidelines. So we got a group of experts together to develop these guidelines, and the idea is that they're there, they're prepared, and then if the fungus or the disease was identified in Australia, the response agencies could take those guidelines and use them to help develop their response to the incursion. And the guidelines have some background information on white nose syndrome, and then it outlines a range of response options and the sorts of things that could be considered depending on the specific situation of the event are potentially closing caves to human access to try and prevent further spread of the disease, doing disease surveillance to understand better where it is, where it's spreading and how it's impacting the bat populations, education and communication. So as I mentioned about sort of early detection of, of new cases in new areas and prevention of spread. And then also some general conservation activities to try and protect the bats. And that could mean, for example, for a critically endangered species, you could consider taking some bats into captivity as an insurance population. You might want to work on mitigating other threats and supporting those populations, and even protecting and restoring bat habitat to reduce some of the other threats other than this disease that could be impacting the population. And if you're interested, those guidelines are available on our website as well. So in terms of response, I guess, management of any wildlife disease is inherently difficult, but there are some quite unique challenges in relation to white nose syndrome. So health and safety issues in particular, firstly, you're working with bats. Secondly, you're working in cave environments, which can be quite dangerous, and you need trained people to assist with that. Resourcing, so having enough vaccinated, experienced bat handlers, and also the equipment, because you would need to look at having dedicated equipment for certain cave environments, and the biosecurity, because the decontamination procedures are quite rigorous with this hot water treatment and chemical disinfection to try and prevent spread by, more spread by human activity. So just in summary, so this is a fungal disease that's had this devastating impact on bat populations in North America. It can be spread by people, and we do believe that bats in Australia would be at risk if white nose syndrome was introduced, and that includes threatened species, including a critically endangered species in the southern states. There is a lot of work going on in terms of prevention and preparedness to try and protect Australia's bats, and there's a role for everyone in Australia, vets, researchers, cavers, members of the public, in terms of knowing what to look out for, and if you see something, reporting it, and keeping contaminated gear out of caves. Okay, so if you're interested in white nose syndrome and you'd like to know more, so there is a section, you can see that screenshot on our Wildlife Health Australia website, so wildlifehealthaustralia.com.au. You can go to the project pages, and there's a bat health focus group page, and all of the documents that I've mentioned today are on that website. So information on how to report suspect cases, the risk assessment and the response guidelines. There's also a page on the Australian Government Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment website. And there's an excellent US website, whitenosesyndrome.org. It's a really good collection of all the information, what we know about white nose syndrome. It has an interactive map, which is where I got that map screenshot from, and linked to the decontamination protocol and sort of latest news. So worth having a look around there. And I guess just generally speaking, if you're interested in bat health, I put out a monthly email newsletter, which is just everything I can find from news and publications on anything to do with bat health. So both from Australia and overseas, anyone can sign up. So you can just send me an email and I can add you to the list. David also kindly gave a plug for joining Wildlife Health Australia. So if you're interested in wildlife health more generally, it is free to become a member. You can sign up on our website, and you'll receive a regular digest newsletter, which has a whole lot of information, news, publications about wildlife health. and also occasional notifications of significant
Thank you.
events.
Thank you.
And also on our website, we have a number of resources, including those biosecurity guidelines that I showed earlier, but also there's a tab with fact sheets. And we've got over 100 fact sheets that a colleague of mine, Andrea, maintains. And every one of them is on a different wildlife disease in Australia, and they just have 4 or 5 pages. So excellent resource if you just want to get the key facts on a particular disease. And we're also on Twitter and LinkedIn, so you can keep up with what's happening in wildlife health in the country. So I'd just like to acknowledge the government agencies that fund us, particularly the Bat Health Focus Group, everyone who was involved with the risk assessment and response guidelines, and our friends at the Australian Speleological Federation. So thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I just want to say, Keren, that was an absolutely fantastic presentation. I thought that you just brought up so many complexities associated with this disease and really made it clear about all the different factors that are involved and a potential impact on Australia. And I'm sure we've got some folks on board that would like to ask some questions. So I'll just open it up to them.
Can I go?
Go for it.
Listen, I'm completely unfamiliar with the organism. Is it, except for the fact there's cold loving, what's its role, like its environmental role? What's it actually doing in the ecosystem?
I don't actually know the answer to that one, Justin. I guess I've been more focused on its impact on bats, but it's a very good question. There's a number of different fungi from that genus found in similar that sort of cave environments. This is the only one that's known to cause disease in animals. But yeah, I don't know the answer to that. It grows on a whole lot of substrates, bat guano certainly, but there's been some work that shows it can grow, in soil and on wood and all sorts of situations. But no, it's a good question. I might have to find out and let you know.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions from anybody?
I have a question. Hi, Keren. I'm Louisa. I really loved your talk. I mean, I heard about white nose diseases, and I knew that it was like a devastating disease, but I didn't know much detail about it. So I was really happy that I had a chance to watch your talk. Thank you. I'm not sure if I missed you saying that, but you were talking about surveillance and about preparedness. Is the environment, like environmental sampling, something that is done to do surveillance, or do we wait for positive cases, like clinical cases, to come up to start working on the surveillance?
Yeah, thanks. It's a good question. And I guess there's the 2 parts to it. There's sort of targeted surveillance and going out and actually looking to see if the fungus is there. And then the general surveillance, which is more what I presented today about, getting information out there and asking people to report if they see suspect cases. So there has been some targeted surveillance. So Peter Holtz, who's a vet who did a PhD in this area, did some surveillance in caves. So both on bats, and also you can also sample cave walls as well. And I guess that's some of the key information that indicates that we don't have the fungus here. I also mentioned that ARC linkage grant, and there may be some surveillance as part of that. But I guess at the moment the focus is on this sort of general surveillance, because it You know, targeted surveillance is difficult. It's you know, it's one point in time, it's expensive. You know, you have to really think about where the high risk might be to do that work. So it's fairly limited in what it can provide, whereas a sort of a general surveillance program allows you to get a bigger reach. You know, and there have been cases, you know, over the years where, you know, members of the public sometimes have reported, you know, a bat with a fuzzy face or fuzzy body, and because they've heard of white nose syndrome, and we've been able to get samples in and show that no, it was something else and it wasn't white nose syndrome. So yeah, that's sort of where the focus of the energy goes.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? Oh, well, I'll just say a couple more things. First of all, again, thank you, Keren, so much for your presentation and all the great stuff that Wildlife Health Australia does. And then secondly, I just want to reiterate that joining Wildlife Health Australia is a fantastic opportunity for us to highlight how interested we are at the University of Sydney and wildlife health related issues, and the digest is to die for. I mean, you get this fantastic list of diseases that are impacting wildlife around the world and the various issues that relate to wildlife. And so many of them now are related to fungal related pathogens. And so it's a great opportunity in just 5 minutes to scan through and see what's happening around the world and let someone else pull all that information together for you and then store it up if you ever need it in the future. So again, Keren, thank you very much. And thank you to everyone who came today. And we'll hopefully have another presentation from you guys on another day sometime in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Keren. Really appreciate that. Okay, bye.
Bye.